Hello everybody, and welcome to the 63rd edition of the Frank and Stan Chat. And as you can see, we have an eminent guest with us today. We have Professor Rachel Lofthouse. So good morning to you, Rachel.
Morning.
Well, thank you for joining us. And of course, we've got the usual colleague, Stan. How are you this morning?
This has gone down from my really good friend and associate to usual.
Yeah, I think we're living such a sad life. Stan and I chatted this week, and he admitted that actually the closest male relationship he has at the moment is with me on Zoom. So it's feeling rather sort of desperate. But anyway, yeah, so here we are again, and it's great that Rachel's joined us. I don't know if Rachel, there may be some people out there who are not entirely sure who you are and what you do, but can you give a little introduction as to, what role you play and what your interests are?
Of course, yeah. I'm sure there's lots of people who have no idea who I am. So I work at Leeds Beckett University. I've been there for 4 years this week, and I'm a professor of teacher education. What that doesn't mean is that I do the kind of day job of educating teachers in the same way that my colleagues do, but it does mean that I've done that in the past. I used to work at Newcastle University, and prior to that I was a secondary teacher for 9 or 10 years. And my interests are teacher education, and specifically the way that we can support teachers to learn not just in their initial stages of development, but right the way through their career. And even more specifically than that, I guess, how we can support teachers to learn with and from each other, and with and from other professionals who have good insight within the system, but may not always have exactly the same roles within the system. So my interests are very much around teacher learning.
Right. So, I mean, in a way that it's for a layperson who's perhaps not involved in initial teacher training and education, there is this sort of issue here about training and education, isn't there? I think that's perhaps at the heart of this market review, which I do want us to cover, because I think that's probably the the sort of the hot topic, I think, at the moment. But we'll get onto that. Stan, what's caught your eye this week?
Parliamentary rules, I think, and what you can and can't say in the House, because interestingly, you can accuse anybody else with parliamentary privilege in the House. You can expose people for what they've done. You can. Yeah, and you've got a privilege that you can't be in trouble for that. But obviously an MP is not allowed to call another member a liar. And that's what happened yesterday. And there was, I don't know if anybody watched it, but there was a flurry of the deputy speaker trying to find what words she could use in order to say, you can't say that. And eventually, of course, she threw her out. But it's the first time, I think, that somebody's actually stood up and said the Prime Minister is lying. I know we miss the beast of Bolsover with his fabulous lines of half the people on the opposite bench are crooks. And then when he was asked to withdraw it, he said, "Okay, half aren't crooks."
Yeah, and the dodgy Dave.
Well, it just seems to be that if some of the things that were said are testable, that they're not in any doubt that what was said was not accurate, let's say, in which case there should be a method by which the speaker at the time asks for those things to be checked, and if they turn out to be not accurate, that whoever said them has to come back to the box and correct them. It's not hard to organise that, but I suspect what will happen now, in a way I kind of hope it will happen, is that more people will stand up and say something as blunt as was said yesterday.
Yeah. Well, what's caught my eye, I was invited to an all-party parliamentary group on T-levels this week, and that one of the key speaker didn't arrive because it was an MP and they were needed in the House. So the key element of it was listening to young people who were currently on undertaking a T-level. And it was clear that a number of them were, very well, all of them appeared very able. They were from right across the country. They were actually doing quite a broad range of courses. a number of them being supported by large businesses like Balfour Beatty. And then was a discussion about, well, how effective are T-levels with SMEs? You know, it's all right getting the co-op or the Balfour Beatty or Barclays involved in it, but actually that in itself will not present sufficient broad enough range for these T-levels to survive with the 45 days sort of work placement that they're meant to include. But the bit that struck me was the fact that there was a sense that, yeah, the T-levels are probably going to work, and actually, you know, that giving young people a broader range of options and choices, you know, and actually valuing sort of that element. I'm trying to avoid using the vocational word, but that is important. But it just ignored, there was no attention, again, being given to the sort of 35–40% of children who don't get their grade 4 in English or maths, and what that means for them. There needs to be opportunities for them in the same way and as much attention given to them as there is for these damn T-levels. And I know the work I do through the co-op is just wanting to make sure that the apprenticeship programs, you know, they're open to as many people as possible. And currently there's again so much attention being given to the degree apprenticeships that actually those young people with lower attainment, but actually loads of talent and skills and whatever, they're not being given any attention. And all they're really ostensibly being asked to do is if at GCSE, to go on to a college and try and do your maths and English again, you know. And I know there's a little bit of flexibility, but it's just simply not good enough. Bearing in mind, my wife went to Tesco's yesterday, and there were clear gaps on the shelves. There was absolutely there were major problems. It appears to be major problems in the supply chain. That actually those sorts of roles are absolutely vital. You know, those roles in terms of HGV drivers and whatever are absolutely vital to us all. But actually, you know, it's again, the government's attention is just about trying to, you know, make the headway with the most able and to support them. But we actually need. I could do with a plumber, by the way. I can't get a plumber. These are the skills that we really do need, and there are young people out there wanting to do them, but the government's simply not focusing sufficiently on this. So yeah, so T-levels for me, and good and bad. But anyway, Rachel, what's caught your eye this week?
Most recently, the teachers' pay freeze. I think it's a really interesting way to end a school year. Interesting in a very generous sense, unlike the pay freeze. But of course it throws up all sorts of dilemmas, doesn't it? How do we respond to that as a profession? It's perfectly legitimate that there's a fair degree of outrage, frustration, anger. You know, I think I described it as shameful on Twitter. I recognise that the economy has taken a hit, that many families have had young adult members forced onto furlough and perhaps now out of work as a result of the pandemic. And it is true to say that, you know, the vast majority of teachers have been able to work in new ways throughout the pandemic, have worked extraordinarily hard, have had to be very flexible, many of them have had to cope with that fine balance of maintaining their professional roles as well as adding in significantly different family roles for many months, not just for a short time, for very many months now. I think it's true to say that you know, the headline of a pay freeze will go down in different ways in different constituencies. You know, I don't mean parliamentary constituencies. I mean in terms of, you know, different walks of life, people with different jobs, different employment, different privileges, different disadvantages. But it does seem like a very symbolic act and a very brutal act, to be fair. And clearly it isn't just about a single freeze, it's about a cumulative effect of similar freezes over now 7 or 8 years, and what that looks like at a time when we can see prices rising quite significantly, costs rising. And the other thing that always captures my attention when we have announcements like that is it triggers that sense of, well, it's all right for you in the north. You know, it's the teachers in the south who will be most significantly impacted by this. And there is some truth to that, but it also overlooks that significant word of nuance. And, you know, even if we just look at house prices, in some parts of the north, house prices are shooting up.
Absolutely.
Rental prices are shooting up. And it's really very difficult to find affordable accommodation on, you know, basic teachers' pay in many parts of the UK, not just in the south. And I do think that it really throws up all sorts of quandaries and dilemmas.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my daughter, our eldest daughter, she has a friend who worked at AstraZeneca and went down from Wilmslow down to Cambridge about 4 years ago. They've now come back to this area, and the house that they bought in Cambridge actually lost value. The house that they wanted, if they went back to buy the house that they'd sold, they would need another £150,000 to buy it. So this idea of, you know, London waiting and all of that, there are areas of the north that are, you know, significantly challenging places to, because London waiting is primarily around housing and transport, isn't it? You know, but there are those areas in the north as well. And so there is this sort of like sense at times, you know, the nuanced word is really good, isn't it? Because, you know, I think that it just depends. It depends where you live.
It really does.
And I think the problem is that the more everyone gets angry about it, the more we'll push the divide again to say, oh yeah, but you know, teachers have had full pay. I've heard that already all through the pandemic, and other people haven't, as if that's some kind of measure that you measure your salary against what other people have gone through, not what you've gone through. And I just, you know, it's like the holidays, it's like everything else that just gets thrown up as soon as there's any objection. And I've always found that nobody really deals with that argument from the teacher's point of view. They just accept it. I mean, if I go back to when I was teaching, the newsagent on the corner, every time I went in and it was getting towards the summer, he would go, oh, you got your 8 weeks. And it wasn't till I sort of got to the point of saying, you do know I'm not paid for those 8 weeks and I have to take them. I can't take time off any other time of year, so I have to take those holidays and I'm not paid for them. And it really opened his eyes, and he said, what do you mean you're not paid? I said, I'm paid for 1265 hours and I've done those by the time we get to the summer, so I have to take that break and I'm not paid. And it just sat him back a bit. It didn't stop him still saying, yeah, but you finish by 3 o'clock and you've, you know, all the usual things. But it is true, you're not actually, teachers aren't paid for the long holidays that they have.
Because actually I'm thinking there about teacher supplies, made me ask you, Rachel, about recruitment. How easy is it then at the moment to recruit, you know, people onto your courses, training to be a teacher? Because it's the government's line here, well, you know, we're awash with applicants, so actually the main thing is we'll have this churn, you know, and actually we're just filling in at the bottom end, you know, with the inexperienced teachers, newly qualified teachers. So what is supply like at the moment?
There's always differences according to subjects. Those persist, but during the pandemic there has been an increase in applicants to teacher education, initial teacher education, particularly at postgraduate level. We had the largest ever cohort through our PGCs this year that's just finishing. It looked like that was going to persist into this academic year, but I think it's going to become more evident over the next 2 or 3 months which of the applicants actually become recruits,
right?
Which don't. There's always some churn at that point. And I think it's tailed off quite significantly. There was a peak earlier in this year in terms of applicants across the board, but it's tailing off again now, perhaps back to more normal numbers. I think you're right. Quite a lot of the government's unwritten expectations of how this works is that as long as you've got enough cheaper, younger teachers, it doesn't really matter what happens at the top end, and that can help to balance the budgets. And I am aware that some of the MATs probably deploy that kind of thinking in their staffing when their budgets are tight or they want to release funds for something else. I know that I think there's something about the perception of salary that influences people's entry into the profession, and I'm not sure that the perceptions are always accurate, whether that's people under perceiving the salary or over perceiving the salary. But it's interesting because it's only one bit of any supply issue, isn't it? But when it hits the headlines, it will have an effect.
Yeah.
But it's also like you said before about housing, where you live and where your schools are. You know, when I was working in Lancashire, we had two of the biggest providers, and there was never a shortage. Even when there was shortages in the country of teachers, we were still getting 60 and 70 applicants for jobs. So the picture, I would imagine, varies around the country.
I think it does, but also it is clear this year that it has been harder for student teachers, training teachers leaving their QTS courses to get jobs this year.
Right.
Again, I haven't got the national figures. I don't know quite how it works region by region, subject by subject, phase by phase. But it would appear that it is harder for those NQTs or early career teachers, as we now call them, to pick up jobs this year. We know that a number have made the conscious decision to go for teaching assistant jobs instead of teaching posts. And that might be because actually they're feeling a little bit more nervous.
Yeah.
Fear of more of disruption in their PGCE or their BA courses, and they're thinking actually a year of being a TA would be another kind of a good way in. And it might be because for some people during the pandemic they actually never left home, so they've done their teacher training, but they've done it from the family home as opposed to leaving home and the costs of leaving home, or they've returned home. They haven't picked up some of those costs, and actually they're not sure that they can afford to leave home yet. So I think there's more people sticking in the family homes, and if you're sticking with the family home, you might feel that you can afford a lower paid job for a while.
Right.
Again.
Yeah.
So I mean, every single case is going to be unique and different, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think it's all part of this unwritten messaging from the government around what they expect to be happening with teaching.
Yeah. Okay, well, so I'm going to stop you there because I want to get onto this market review. Definitely. A couple of weeks ago, probably it must be about 6 weeks ago, we had Sam Twisselton on here, and she's part of the group that have been looking or sort of bringing together this market review, which is now out at consultation. I don't think I've ever experienced anything quite like this in the ITTE world, in that there is just this deep suspicion about what this review is actually about. And I wonder, because vast majority of teachers, I asked my 3 children yesterday, 2 of whom are teachers, if they'd ever heard of it. None of them have heard of it, you know. So I think there's a role here for us to sort of just push this out and give a sort of a broader view as to what this market review is and what your concerns are about it. So really, the stage is yours at this point, Rachel.
Okay, well, I won't claim to be an absolute expert, but I've certainly got some informed views in relation to it. So essentially, if we go back to, over the last decade, what's happened in initial teacher education, and I will persist in calling it education, is that the DFE have allowed for, in fact, encouraged, enabled, been determined about broadening out the base of provision of teacher, the way they would call it, teacher training. So they've gone out of their way to create more routes into teaching. So, for example, the troops into teaching is a new route into teaching. Now Teach, trying to recruit people who've kind of finished other careers, as opposed to the Teach First, which is teach before you start your other careers. And then we've got our, multiple provisions. So we've got our skits, and we've got our university provision, etc., etc. So the government's gone out of its way to really broaden out the base of routes into teaching. And all of those routes are subjected to Ofsted, inspections, quality assurance. Therefore, they're framed around what is necessary in relation to that quality assurance process. And they are also framed around whatever the current government requirements are around what should be part of a teacher training course, as they would call it, teacher training. What they have done in the last year is essentially call a halt to that. And they've almost said, they wouldn't say it like this, this is wrong, we've got this wrong. There are now too many providers. It is too complicated. If you want to become a teacher, you don't know where to start. The UCAS system was complicated as a result of it. If you drove around any city, you could see banners outside schools saying train to teach here. You have to try and work out, well, what is that school advertising? Is it advertising itself as a skit? Is it part of a skit down the road or across a county border? What is it actually advertising? But it's like, well, you can even see them on roundabouts, train to teach at this organisation. So it has been a fairly crazy 10 years. What that's meant is that it's almost become like the Wild West. Now that suggests complete chaos. It suggests, lots of kind of barren landscape into which cowboys disappear. And that's not what I mean. I don't mean to suggest that anybody is a cowboy in teacher education, but it is fairly chaotic. At the same time as being chaotic, however, what it's done is it's broadened out the expertise of people who were able to support trainee teachers, student teachers, and new teachers, because it's required a real investment in mentoring, a rethinking of partnership. It's allowed in some settings some quite bespoke provision to be developed. So yes, we have to be compliant. Yes, we have to follow the national frameworks. But if you've got a local skit that's attached to a teaching school, for example, in an area of distinct need, with local socioeconomic conditions, local educational outcome patterns, opportunities for particular partnerships and relationships, it has allowed some very bespoke provision to be created. And that's helped us to create some really interesting ways of working. So there are pros and there are cons of what we have, but essentially the ITTE review has been set up to clear a lot of that away. The basic premise is there are too many providers, it's too complicated, there is too much variation, and we don't want that. Essentially, that's what the DFE is saying. We want to pull back to a more centralised control, the teacher training model.
Is the training element of that, as opposed to the education element, also part of the general concern that actually, if you're a relatively small school-based provider, and if the move is to sort of try and enable more schools to do more of that development, actually, are you then just being easy pickings for an ideological approach to what education is about? So in effect, universities or your university has scale, it has size, it has influence, and actually can push back or try to push back against this sort of an attempt to put a preferred model in the way that teachers are developed and what they need to understand. Whereas in the school setting, it's a lot more difficult to do that. You sit there alone. You may have some support. You may even have a university there. But actually, if it's about moving towards a school-based system more, then actually is there then just an open door for, well, if you want to carry on doing it, you're going to have to deliver this, whether it's the history curriculum or whatever,
I think so. It's complicated because what we had before the market review was the development of a common core curriculum for initial teacher training. And that's already in place, and it's being inspected against, brutally inspected.
Yeah, well, so that people are aware, there are, was it 11, 12, or perhaps more than that, recent Ofsted inspections, which in the past have viewed a lot of that provision as certainly meeting the standard, if not better than that. But there are some worrying sort of trends that are emerging from those reports that suggest that they're taking a different line on this now, suddenly.
All providers were either good or better up until this last framework. And I've taken the time to read a couple of reports, and because I am naturally cynical, you find the bits that's actually tipped. You know, I was looking at one where the early years provision was inadequate, and when you try and find what was it that actually nailed this, there isn't anything, because everything about it is good, apart from the teaching of creative arts. I think it was teaching of creative arts in early years. I think Picasso would say, take your hands off creative arts in the early years, because they're more creative than you are. But it's a tiny fraction, and that has been multiplied up. And my favorite one is still a weakness in the leadership, because they didn't realize they weren't as bad as they are, when Ofsted in that position had every single provider as good or better. So at that point, Ofsted thought they were better. The government thought they were better than they are. It's just, with my cynical head on, it's inspectors been told, you need to really come down on some of these providers. Let's use this as a way of executing some early.
I think there is a real fear that that's what's happened over the last few months. So there's two elements to that. One of them is the new framework, which we've been implementing in a time of the pandemic, and is a significant change to a lot of provision, and is a very heavy framework in terms of content. It's not that any individual pieces of that framework for initial teacher education is deemed to be entirely irrelevant. It's just that it's this kind of micromanagement of so many elements of content that then have to be somehow mapped across an entire program, which is in itself delivered between the central provider and every school placement and every conversation with a mentor and every bit of feedback that a student or a trainee teacher gets from a lesson observation. They are supposed to be reflective of this brand new micromanaging framework. And there are two problems with the framework. One is the amount of content that we then now have to micromanage within a program, and the expectation that every single trainee or student teacher, regardless of their context, will be able to answer a question. It's almost like the Ofsted inspectors have prepared a question. It's a closed question, and if that trainee at that moment falters in their answer to it, so it might be around working memory or cognitive load or phonics, if that trainee can't answer immediately with the right, correctly worded phrase, then that's a red flag as far as Ofsted is concerned. And it's this notion of the know that, the way that the curriculum is framed, that you are expected to know that all of these micro elements are relevant to you and necessary to you, regardless of whether you're sitting in an early years classroom or an A-level photography lesson.
So,
is it this micromanagement of content? So there's partly that framework which is challenging, which was challenged when it was brought in, but it was brought in regardless. And Ofsted were inspecting against that framework this year for the first time. And initially we were reassured that we were being inspected on the basis that this was a transition year. That inevitably we were going from existing curriculum and program design to new, and that the inspection process would take that into account. And I think the real concerns are that notion of transition has been utterly dropped and disregarded. And that brutality of the, well, you have one student who could not answer the question on working load, on memory, you know, that actually working memory, cognitive load. You see, if I'd have got it wrong there. It really failed.
Oh, well, hang on, better write that down.
That's a good example. And I, you know, that would have brought a red flag up. And that is the sort of thing that appears to be triggering these inadequate responses. Now, that's upsetting to the sector. It's not fair to the sector. It's not what was written initially about the inspection process. But in addition to that, what the inspectors chose to do, presumably because they had to fill some time to justify their existence, was a series of so-called research visits. So they went to a number of providers, universities and SCITs, sort of springtime this year, to find out how they were managing provision during the pandemic. There was no way of opting in or opting out. You know, if Ofsted wanted to come, they would essentially come, and they'd be there for quite a long time. It wasn't just a quick phone call. You know, tell us what you're doing, what's difficult, what's possible. They were there for quite a long time. We weren't inspected, but I know a number of colleagues in other institutions who were. As I say, they were framed as research visits, not inspections. What they then did was they wrote a synthesis of that, and the headline was that initial teacher training providers were not being ambitious enough during the pandemic. And they, you know, pulled apart all sorts of things that we essentially weren't doing very well. They identified some of the things that were challenges, and they recognized some of the things that were happening, but they chose to headline it as we weren't ambitious enough. And again, there's that sense that, well, that's a convenient headline to come out from a series of so-called research visits just ahead of the market review. And now what's happening just after the market review are these individual reports. Essentially are downgrading a lot of providers. And yes, I'm a cynic as well. I see this as part of a machine.
I thought the bit that caught me, I don't know if it was the Cumbria one or Solent, was that the trainees were very happy with the provision, but they didn't have a benchmark because they'd never been trained before. So their judgment wasn't worth anything. So, and I don't know how they did this. They said that previous trainees or trainees that had now had time in schools felt the provision wasn't that. So, but that provision would have been prior to whatever's going on now.
Yeah, because of both the transition from one framework to another, but also because of the pandemic.
So
what I think I find most upsetting about this is that if you are the named provider, so if you're the university or the SCIT, it looks like this is your fault, but actually underneath all of this is this complicated network of hardworking mentors and school leaders who opt into supporting teacher education. They are not, you know, there is no obligation for them to. And actually, as you start to read through these sorts of reports or those generic reports around, you know, the kind of not ambitious enough, it's essentially saying you're not good enough. You're just not good enough. And that's such a negative.
In a sense, that's how I met with Sam, because I was chair of a SCIT in Lancashire, Northwest SCIT, and one of the universities that supported us decided that we were a risk, not because we were doing anything wrong, but the feeling was that SCITs were going to be hit fairly hard, and that might affect their overall judgment. So they withdrew from the partnership at virtually no notice. And it was the University of Cumbria that said, well, we will continue to support you. Otherwise, we would have just been dead in the water at that point.
Is there a risk that I mean, I've seen a number of responses to the market review from universities. I mean, a number of them said that we don't support it, but there's also a tone to some of them about, well, actually, if this is where it's going, we don't really want anything to do with it. Is that a risk?
I think there is a genuine risk, because what's expected is that every single provider, university or other, will have to go through a new form of reaccreditation. So all programs are accredited, they're validated, otherwise we can't run them. But we're expected to go through a new national program of reaccreditation in a very short time frame. And when you look at the criteria for that reaccreditation, it is changing the goalposts quite significantly. So there's no long lead into this. There's no funding to allow us to develop the type of provision and partnership and training models that the framework is recommending will be necessary. The accreditation process will be based upon. There is a genuine risk that it's just impossible for some providers to jump through that many hoops that quickly, even if they felt that that was the right model. And there are two kind of tensions here in the recommendations. One is the speed at which they want this delivered. And actually there's a pushback and just saying, well, can you not just give us longer? This might be more possible if we have longer. But then if we just say give us longer, it's as if we're saying that the rest of the recommendations are fine.
Yeah.
And we're content and happy with them. And not all of them are fine. They are essentially a mechanism by which we, I mean, it's interesting because we've gone from this, these hundreds and hundreds of providers, many of whom are actually quite small. And the government is saying we want bigger partnership provision with a kind of, let's say 500 trainees in each partnership, which would require a certain capacity, a certain number of schools. And that actually that has to be fully coherent. So that's probably, going to the big mats, to the big teaching school hubs, who might or might not be working in partnership with universities, but that is a complete reconfiguration of the nature of partnership. And what will happen is that there will be some providers of different scale and of different type who just physically are not able to meet that accreditation timescale or expectation. The bit about the universities, I think, is particular in that, universities also have their own internal quality assurance and validation process. We aren't just training providers, we are education organisations. We have to have learning objectives, we have to have assessment protocols that go beyond, if you like, that very straitjacketed training provision. Otherwise, we can't claim that these are degrees that have equivalencies with other degrees, that have equivalencies internationally, that allow for the development of critical thinking. We can't claim those things if we are straitjacketed by a very, very narrow set of accreditation criteria. And even when we get the response which says, well, don't forget the accreditation criteria or the common core curriculum, that's just the basic requirement. You can do whatever else you want on top. If you then particularly look at PGCE and the number of days that a trainee now has to be in school, and the tightness that the recommendations have about what that school experience will involve, it is okay to say you can embellish and have additionality in your courses, but you can't if you don't have any additional funding. Because the funding is also, the idea is the funding will be, there will be no more funding. The existing funding will have to be reallocated, and it will work to, it won't work in favour of those broader, richer curricula. It can't.
Where do the universities stand then with regard to government ideology? I think I've seen, Stan and I have spoken many times about this sort of control that the government seem to want to have over lots of stuff that schools do, and the sort of the way that teachers teach. So I mean, the element of education is really important for a student to actually sort of synthesize and understand, that you need to be wary of this gimmick or this silver bullet that's coming at you. You need to have a range of approaches, or an understanding of a range of approaches. How are we getting to a point where the government's desire for control is going to butt up, if it's not already, with universities' academic belief or desire for academic freedom, you know, to actually sort of synthesize what they see as the research and to actually educate and support young people or people to be teachers. You know, is how tense is that at the moment?
That's exactly where we're at. That's exactly where we're at. And it is the basic argument between training and education.
Yeah.
And it's not just in initial teacher training and education, it now runs right the way through. So if you go back, you know, don't have to go very far back in time, where there was a significant promotion of teachers gaining master's degrees. There was funding through the postgraduate provision for teachers to be subsidised to gain those master's degrees. In order for them to be subsidised, those universities that wanted to attract those teachers did have to have their master's programs on an approved list. So it wasn't, you know, we weren't
it wasn't a free for all
random education, but that was on the basis that these were good practitioner masters. So these were the sorts of masters that would really help develop both practical skills, the craft skills, if you like, but based on an enhanced understanding of the research and an ability also to be part of a network of critical thinkers, whether that was your peers as master's students or your university tutors. And you know, again, we had worked our way up to a national Masters in Teaching and Learning, which drew on those principles, you know, and even that was, to be fair, you know, we questioned why we needed to develop brand new programs that the money would be shifted to when actually the existing programs were doing the job quite well. But, you know, we'd spent a long time designing Masters in Teaching and Learning, and some of them, given enough maturity, would have resulted in some fantastically well-educated new teachers, new heads of department. But that was all pulled. There is almost no access to funding to do masters anymore, other than another loan. You can't take that loan out unless you're doing a full masters. Well, if you've got postgraduate teacher education, then you've already gained some master's credits, but you can't use those master's credits towards the masters that you want to get the loan for.
Right.
All bits of a jigsaw that are hidden but have real implications, because it stops people coming into masters. We have plenty of master's students, don't get me wrong, but they're self-funding, they're international, they're coming in at career stages. So the government's essentially withdrawn its support for both, you know, well, for master's level provision, and it's taken the money that it might have spent on that and is now, for example, reconfiguring all the MPQs.
Yes.
I was just going to bring up the MPQs.
Saying that's your route, and the MPQs are framed on exactly the same premise as ITTE Core Content Early Career Framework, a very defined and particular set of principles of what it takes to be a teacher or a leader.
I think
not the whole picture.
That comes across very heavily in the market review for mentors, or for schools that are providing mentors, or that schools are providing support. The MPQs, I mean, I think it virtually says at one point you must have at least one member of staff in the school that holds an MPQ to be able to be accredited.
Well, you have to, it's this new MPQ in teacher development, which they're expecting the lead mentors to. And I don't have a problem with well-qualified mentors. Yeah. And if that's a suitable route for some, then that's perfectly valid. But it's essentially controlling every step of the way, and doing it using a number of levers. So I think, Frank, you mentioned that very many teachers inevitably, and school leaders, will be unfamiliar with what's going on in ITT. And that's because they've got their, you know, inevitably they've got their heads down and they're getting on and they're doing their job. And it's, you know, if you're a cynic, you would say, well, isn't it convenient that at the time when school leaders and teachers are utterly battered and exhausted, they're going to bring this wave of changes in, which can go somewhat unnoticed. But I think there should be some concern, because it actually, when you start to put all of that together, the government talks about a golden thread, they talk about streamlining, they talk about, you know, world-class teacher training, you know, they love their slogans, but what it's actually doing is narrowing down the routes into teaching, narrowing down the opportunities for teachers to develop throughout their career, and essentially privileging the money into certain providers' pockets. So, and again, some people say, well, that's fair enough. We need providers who have the enough funding to have the capacity to do the job well. But there are others amongst us who say, but if you actually look at who's heading up these organisations, who are the key people who are making decisions, it's come from a very small.
Rachel, do we know who's actually authored the market review?
No, we know who was on the advisory panel.
Yeah, that I've read the review. So the only people mentioned in the advisory panel. So I just assumed at the end it would have a name of somebody who had actually written it. I find that really unusual.
It's extremely unusual that there is no naming of anybody in there. And it's what's really laughable is the way that they talk about we believe the sector can't do this without reform. But who is the we? The names are not there. We assume it's the advisory panel, but they're not saying anything other than Sam, who said we need to be cautious about this. The rest of them are just kind of getting on with their day jobs. It's as if they've disappeared. But no, it is very unusual, and either that's because in the end the advisory panel didn't write it, or certain members didn't, and there was an agreement, therefore we won't put names on, or they knew that it would be hugely controversial and they didn't want their names on, or they just don't think it matters. Just, you know, is it the case now that it just doesn't matter? If something's got the DFE stamp on it, we just have to accept it as gospel, or we shouldn't have to challenge or expect any accountability from the authors.
But a good teacher, according to that framework, should be questioning.
Well, we've been talking here for about 45 minutes, and most of our chats now are 30 minutes. But I would like to end with just I would like to end positively, but it's not come into my head. So if one of you can.
Well, I'll tell you what I'd like to say, Frank, that throughout teacher training, I've been involved with 2 skits in my time. The whole thing is based on really, really hardworking people who play as mentors, who work in the schools, who do their best to bring in the new teachers into our organisation, and it's fairly sure, it certainly was in my time, that's all voluntary and it's all additional work, and it's based on those people being able to do that job. And you know what it's like, the more pressure you put on, the easier it is in times like this for people to say, do you know what, I'm not doing that anymore. And I don't know, I mean, Rachel will know what it's like picking up new mentors, but I would suggest it's not looking like something that's favourable, because it doesn't necessarily help your career provision either. It's something, my view of it, and I apologise if it's wrong, but my view of it is it's a vocational thing. It's something that people want to do to support the profession, to support children. And I think on a positive note, they're doing a great job.
And I think you're absolutely right, Stan. There is an extraordinary level of commitment from within the profession to support new entrants into the profession, or to support people who are making career moves, you know, heads of department that reach out and help new heads of department, for example. Most of that is done voluntarily, but very little of it is properly funded. Most of it is done because a good teacher and a good school leader wants to be a good teacher and leader for the new profession, just as much as they do for the children and young people in their care. And the partnerships that we have rely extraordinarily heavily on the expertise that is built up over time. The real vulnerability here is that we lose that expertise, and that actually whatever we're having to rebuild in the future is based on significantly less expertise than we have already in the system.
And on that point, I think we'll end this week's chat. Fascinating. I mean, I've learned so much, and highlighted also, when you've got this sort of experience, you realize how little you know about what is going on. So I found it really interesting to have your insight, and I hope that people who've watched this have got, even if they haven't even heard of the market review or read it, but actually they've got a better understanding of the risks that are associated with it and why people like you and ourselves remain concerned about where it's all heading. Love to have you back. Let's see what happens. Perhaps when the review is announced, we'll have a real humdinger and bring Rachel back to join us. But thank you, Rachel, for your time this morning, and thank you, Stan. And we'll see you next week, where we've got Liz Robinson coming. So that's and also I don't know if we've mentioned it, but we have got Fiona Miller joining us in September. So looking forward to Fiona joining us. And we'll have a 2-week break after next week. We'll go on our summer holidays, Stan, and then we'll come back and join them again. So thank you all, everybody. And thank you, Rachel, again.
Thanks.